Very important is to make the difference between data and intelligence. Data is what you get from your sensor, from your satellites, from your objects on the ground, on the air, and so on. It's only data. From the moment you bring data together, you may get some information. That will be, let's say, a more consolidated thing. From the moment you are analyzing your information with a threat in your mind, you come to intelligence. And that's the part which is really classified. And that's the part where the sharing is not that easy while keeping neutrality.
Hey Space Watchers, and welcome to another episode of our Space Cafe Radio. Space is changing fast. Nations are building military space commands, defense ministries publish space doctrine, and the boundaries between civilian and military space infrastructure is becoming increasingly blurred. And now Switzerland, a traditionally neutral, cooperation-driven nation, has released its Gesamtkonzeption Weltraum, comprehensive military space concept. What does it mean for Swiss security, for European cooperation, and for the country's role in a rapidly militarizing orbit? Col Monnerat, you have been deeply involved in shaping Swiss strategic thinking and military doctrine, and you are one of the key voices behind Switzerland's evolving space posture. Ludovic, how are you doing? Welcome to Space Cafe Radio.
Thank you very much. I'm doing well, thanks.
So, why does Switzerland, as a neutral country, need a military space concept at this moment, and what is the strategic trigger?
I think the trigger was 10 years ago when we noticed that a revolution was taking place in space. Something was changing deeply regarding the number of satellites, the capabilities being built up were driven by new space, but also leading to a mass production of new platforms. And the consequences for the armed forces were quite clear. The traditional way of doing space would be obsolete in a short time notice. And we had to adapt ourselves in order to mitigate risks, but of course in order to exploit some opportunities. And that's the reason why we have been thinking about space the last 10 years and defined the first concept. Now, of course, since the war in Ukraine, everybody is aware about the importance of space for military operations and, of course, the normal functionalities of societies as a whole. So now today, to defend a country without space-based assets is basically not possible anymore.
Is this concept mainly a reaction to global developments, or does Switzerland already experience concrete vulnerabilities or threats in space?
I think that vulnerability in Switzerland, not in space, but still, as a small country, yes, a space nation with leading industries, leading academies, but still without own sovereign space-based assets. Those developments that we saw 10 years ago already showed us that a future would be defined by the people able to do something into space. If you don't want to be left on the side, it was for us a necessity to assess the situation, to develop a concept in order to have space-based capabilities in the whole development of the future armed forces.
You state in the concept that Switzerland wants a largely autonomous space picture, but without national radar, telescopes in orbit, or sovereign tracking infrastructure, is true autonomy achievable? Or will Switzerland remain dependent on the US and France, Germany, and commercial providers?
Of course, true autonomy is not achievable, and no nation is able to be true autonomous regarding space situational awareness and space domain awareness. Even the US Space Command does need cooperation and support from partners and allies and commercial entities. From our side, we decided early to develop our own software, to develop our own databases regarding the situation in space. So we crafted our own tailored solutions in order to answer our own needs. And the need was quite simple. We wanted, and we still want, to be able to understand what's going on in space, what could happen in space, and especially based on those elements, to know when our tactical units in the Swiss Armed Forces can be observed and listened to from space. That's a key capability that is not right now being developed, introduced widely in the armed forces, especially regarding movements. For us, it was really the reason why we need some sovereignty, some autonomy for space situational and space domain awareness. We have been developing some assets of our own, especially in cooperation with the Swiss companies, with the Swiss academic entities. If you think about the University of Bern, the Astronomical Institute, we are working with them since 2018. 2018. So it's quite a long time now. We have been working with other organizations in Switzerland, with commercial companies, being able themselves to develop observation stations that we are using every day. And we are using own sensors on the ground, optical sensors, electromagnetic sensors that are detecting activities and signals from space that not many nations are able to detect. Just to give you an example, the last weekend we have been, with our own software, convinced that there was a rendezvous, a proximity operation going on between Syracuse 3A, all the French military satellites, and USA 324. 1 year later, then the same RPO, so to say, between the same satellite from the French and USA 325. Those are GSAP satellites, those are inspector satellites of the US in orbit. So we have some assets giving us sometimes information, knowledge in advance that not many nations do have.
But just to recap that, Switzerland does not have military assets in space at the moment.
That's right.
But Switzerland has commercial assets in space.
In fact, we have a cooperation with Swiss companies having assets in space. We have some payloads in space as well. We are working closely with some Swiss companies that, of course, you know of. And we have been testing some payloads in space, in orbit, since more than 1 year, in order to have the information we need to have, after that, the end of the development and the procurement phase. And the procurement phase is then a political process when you have to show to our political decision makers that we have a sound basis for decision making regarding the investment into space.
In the document, you emphasize Swiss contribution to EO, Earth observation. But as we just mentioned, Switzerland does not have military Earth observation capabilities. So what does contribution really mean? So is it then data analysis, value-added services, or eventual sovereign collection capabilities? So how would you define that?
Some data analysis could be part of the game, that's right. We have been developing with some Swiss companies some platforms to use space-based imagery in a fairly automatized manner with the integration of, let's say, directed artificial intelligence. That gives the opportunity for the customer to teach his or her own algorithm. But I think the main effort for us is through ESA. With our own development in the project of the European Space Agency, especially regarding European resilience from space, we are advancing things that play a role in Earth observation, which could be quite important. We have one project right now being discussed exactly during this week in Bremen in cooperation with the Swiss Space Office, so with the link with ESA from Switzerland, and we are trying to develop with other countries some capabilities that no small country would be able to develop from itself. That would be a contribution that we would have regarding Earth observation.
How is this collaboration with ESA or through ESA seen? Because ESA's policy for non-military activities is now blurred over the last year or years, so to say. They state we do peaceful defense-driven activities, no aggressive one, no offensive one. So how can that collaboration with ESA look like? As an R&D center, or in which direction are you going?
In fact, I think that ESA changed quite a lot. You just said it in the last 2 years. First of all, ESA decided to be faster, better, to be more agile, and to be able to craft some new capabilities with less money and less time than before, which is absolutely fine, of course, for military customers, because we need to have some new capabilities quite fast. On the other hand, ESA decided 1 year ago that exactly that they're going to be able to do some dual-use capability building. And that's, of course, very interesting for the military, especially from the small nations, which are not able to do that all alone. Because then ESA would play a role as a program manager, would be able to support those projects to bring its technical knowledge regarding Earth observation or other capabilities and support the development of new space-based assets in Europe.
Let's talk satellite communication. It's also part of the document. The key question is, will Switzerland create its own sovereign SATCOM layer, or will it continue relying on commercial operators? And how do you secure those links in an hybrid conflict then?
Regarding SATCOM, our first intent that we had more than 7 years ago when we defined our first conception would be, of course, a permanent coverage of Switzerland and the regions abroad when we have some ongoing military operations. That would be for us some peace support operations in the Balkans or in some neighboring areas. But of course, the main part of the Swiss armed forces are being used in Switzerland. That's our main job, to defend our own country. And for this permanent coverage, geostationary satellites were, for us, the first part of the answer. That's the reason why we sent some findings 2 years ago at ITU for 5 position on the geo belt with the right services and with the right frequencies. So that you can use 1 gigahertz of Ka band in order to support the communication of the Swiss Armed Forces as part of an overall concept, of course. There's a concept for telecommunication of the Swiss Armed Forces. One part is space-based, and it has been foreseeing since more than 10 years something regarding satellites. That was the first step. The second step is when we realized that the development of technologies, especially regarding smartphones, were giving us the ideal user segment in the pocket of every one of our soldiers. That's the reason why the D2D, direct-to-device, is for us a very hot topic. In fact, we did some tests. We tested some solutions with some secure smartphone directly connected to satellites, with some small add-ons, with a sleeve on the smartphone, and able to exchange some messages through those add-ons, especially with, of course, Swiss companies. And there is one called Astrocast, which is being active for many years regarding IoT, and that can be used to send messages. So for us, the solution that we intend to have in the future is to try to use those capabilities, those commercial partners, maybe in the next generation, in order to exchange encryption keys in a sovereign manner so that we can use fairly normal communication solution, ground-based, space-based, with smartphones which are secure themselves. That would be a higher level of security being able to be used on an everyday basis. This intent can be described already in August 2023 in the new strategy of the Swiss Armed Forces about the reinforcement of the defense capabilities. So it's not something completely new. It's been a couple of years that we are working on this, and we have some capabilities in Switzerland in order to develop the assets, giving us the right amount of security. That would be post-quantum encryption. That's the key for the future.
It's post-quantum encryption.
Yes.
Define that for me. I'm not even on the quantum
Yes, but you see right now quantum computers being put into service. Yeah. There is one in Switzerland, by the way, in Basel, interestingly, by a company called IonQ, which did buy Capella Space. And so we are not far away from space with those capabilities, which is quite interesting. And those quantum computers should be able in the near future to crack the protection that we have right now with fairly normal encryption system. With post-quantum encryption, we should have the solution to prevent this loss of security and to be sure that the data you are being using and transmitting is secure for a certain amount of time, which will be enough for the armed forces.
I see. Coming back to the D2D concept that you just mentioned, Europe is not very strong in D2D activities. We are talking about it, but when it comes to assets in space, Europe is very reserved in its response. Coming back to my question of your own SATCOM assets, are you thinking about your own D2D asset in space or using commercial providers then with the higher level of security? Because I wasn't sure where these 5 orbital positions, we're talking about geopositions, then come into play.
Those geopositions were not meant for D2D. They were meant for broadband communication, fairly classical, but of course with an interesting relationship between cost and product and service. That's what we are looking for. We need really something that is absolutely the best one for the amount of money that we have. Regarding D2D, it's still open. We are still in the phase when we are assessing different possibilities, so the project is not that fairly advanced. I think we can say that we have been testing a couple of things on the ground with space-based assets, but not up to the point when you can say, hey, we are ready to procure. We need to do some more steps and to prepare some more advanced projects before to be able to go enter a procurement phase.
Switzerland has a very specific position politically in Europe, not being part of the EU, not being part of NATO. One of the EU services that is getting used on the military side more and more as part of our sovereignty is the PRS service of Galileo. So how can you access that? I mean, there is an involvement of Switzerland into that, or are you relying in a crisis situation on open GNSS services?
In fact, Switzerland has been part of the Galileo project from the beginning. So we have been financing parts of those activities and with the expectation, of course, to access the PRS solution. And right now, our Federal Office of Topography, called the Swiss Topo, would be the center of competence to handle those highly precise data in Switzerland. On the other hand, of course, we expect to have the best GPS signal. We did have the best GPS signal 30 years ago when we did buy the FA-18 of the US. So the best airplane we could afford at that time. Now with the decision to buy F-35A, we expect, of course, to have the same standard of positioning that is linked with this buy and to have the classified GPS signal as well.
As a neutral state that Switzerland is by its constitution, so where is Switzerland's red line? Does defense mean cyber and spectrum protection only, or could it involve physical protective measures as well? Germany speaks openly about offensive space capabilities in its new space doctrine. So where's the red line for Switzerland?
First of all, of course, neutrality has a political dimension. That is way over my own level of responsibility. On the other hand, you can only be neutral as long as you are not being attacked by some other countries. If you are being attacked, you are not neutral anymore. That was always the strategy of Switzerland, of course, to prepare itself to defend alone, but in case of an armed conflict with an attack from some foreign nation, to be able to cooperate with other nations. That's the reason why, of course, we need interoperability in many parts of the armed forces, to have this option on the table, not to be condemned to be all alone. Regarding what you just mentioned about activities in space, the last operational capability we have been developing is called defensive counterspace. That means what we intend to mean. So you have to defend yourself in space, but it's not the idea to attack somebody else in space. So it's the force protection part that we need to ensure, and it has to be ground-based, mainly with observation, with, of course, some solution in order to detect ongoing threats against your own space-based assets, up to some maneuver in space and some protection capabilities in space. More than that, I cannot say because we don't know. That was the last operational capabilities on the priority list. We began with space situational awareness, space domain awareness, then imagery intelligence, electron intelligence, then satellite communication. And the fifth one will come later. So we still have some conceptual work to do before we are able to define a solution. The thing is, now some people are saying, like the American with the official doctrine, space is a war-fighting domain. And some other people are saying up to the highest level, the next war will begin in space. We'll see. But still, we have to be ready to bear the consequences of such activities. That's the reason why not only threats, but also risks in space are a big topic of interest.
It's interesting because I had a similar conversation with the German space commander, Michael Traut, and their ongoing demonstration activities, demonstrator satellites are in the planning called Sword and Shield. And they said very clear, a shield is great to protect, but you need a sword, at least in your hands, to give the clear impression to the enemy to make its calculation. And seeing it then from a neutral state sounds a bit different in the rhetoric that you just mentioned. So that's
a little bit different when you consider only space. That's right.
Yeah.
But from a purely military thinking perspective, that's absolutely right. A shield alone, as well as a sword alone, cannot be very useful. So you need both. You need offensive and defensive capabilities. But it doesn't mean that you need offensive and defensive capabilities in space. In a multi-domain approach, of course, every operational domain does contribute to the overall effect. So maybe the solution would be to target some ground stations with some airborne assets, with long-range precision weapons. Or maybe the solution is something else. That's really part of the operational art of war.
I would like to come back to the neutral point. Space is not a neutral domain, as you just mentioned as well. So can Switzerland stay neutral while depending heavily on foreign, sometimes classified systems? Where does cooperation ends and dependency begins?
That's a very valid point. And that's the reason why Switzerland always decided in the last years to be assured that neutrality will be kept in every circumstance. You know that Switzerland did enter a cooperation with France regarding the use of space-based optical imagery. Part of the agreement was, of course, the possibility for Switzerland to get out of the agreement at every moment in order to keep neutrality alive. And that would be the same for every kind of cooperation with other nations. We need to have a limit so we can be sure that we are staying neutral. Of course, that's a political thing, so I only infer based on the decisions being made until now, but probably it's something that would stay that way in the future.
How difficult is it then to share data or to have access to the relevant data? Because data sharing among organizations within a country is a challenge. When we talk about classified data and cross-border, it's, I would call it in my words, a nightmare. So how is the situation for you?
Very important is to make the difference between data and intelligence. Those are really completely different things. Data is what you get from your sensor, from your satellites, from your objects on the ground, on the air, and so on. It's only data. From the moment you get data and you bring data together, you may get some information. That will be, let's say, a more consolidated thing. From the moment you are analyzing your information with a threat in your mind, you come to intelligence. And that's the part which is really classified. And that's the part where the sharing is not that easy while keeping neutrality. And some countries have some clear legal obstacles to share intelligence, but not to share data.
So raw data access, as we want to call it, is not that issue.
Absolutely. Just to give you an example, regarding the surveillance of airspace, there is a data sharing going on between different nations. That doesn't mean that everything will be shared regarding some classified activities, but still the ground data sharing solution, which is helping everybody and not an obstacle to any neutrality.
In the concept, you mentioned the 850 million Swiss francs. Is that enough? I mean, your budget sounds very modest by international standards, where we talk about billions these days in and out. Can Switzerland build meaningful resilience with this level of investment?
At least that's the plan. And of course, we cannot have the same solutions as other countries, which are able, for instance, to invest 1.2 billion of euros for two radar imagery satellites, like in Spain, or two telecommunication satellites, like in Germany. So we cannot have the same solutions. We need to do something else. And for us to do something else first is to have a national partnership and to cooperate with Swiss companies, with the industry, and with also some people being active on the downstream so that we can bring our resources together. So this overall budget of the armed forces is only one part of the thing that we estimate necessary to develop space-based capabilities. But that's the part that we think that we should invest ourselves in order to be sovereign in different areas of those capabilities while cooperating with Swiss entities. Industries, of course, all the governmental organizations, not only at the federal level, at the cantonal level as well, and of course with Swiss academic entities, which are very active in the space domain.
And my last question goes again about the concept. When I read it, I would say the concept is unusually transparent about weaknesses and limits. Is it meant to build trust and manage expectations, or signals to partner that Switzerland needs deeper cooperation? Because it's an interesting positioning that you alluded to.
In fact, this conception about space is the fourth big document of the Swiss armed forces in the last 8 years. The first third has been built basically the same, or the other way around. We did the same as the first. We explained the development of the situation, the needs which should arise from these developments, what we have right now, the weaknesses we have, the strengths, of course, the possible solutions for the future. That's really the construction. And in this way, yes, we are quite transparent about this. Regarding the report about the future of the air defense, we wrote in 2017 that we needed a certain amount of modern fighter jet. We did the same for the future of the land forces in 2019 with a certain amount of armored vehicles, main battle tanks, artillery, batteries, and so on. So it's really something that is important because it is the contribution of the armed forces, not only to its communication, but to the political debate. That's a military plan. It's not a decision. That's really our intent. And then has to be discussed at the political level because every decision regarding the budgeting will be taken every year in the normal political process, first by the government and after that by the parliament. And when the parliament decides, then you may get the budget and you may enter the next step of the development of the project.
Thank you very much for your time and that very insightful and open conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.spacewatch.global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.